Life is a workout, and Smoothie King is here to help you power through. Whether you're crushing morning miles or sprinting through back-to-back meetings, give your body the energy, protein, and power it needs to help you conquer your goals. Only at Smoothie King.
First were enigmatic called, then, an abundant documentation of the most diverse disciplines. And finally, according to many witnesses, the presence of extraterrestrial ships. It is not a movie. We are in Madrid of the 60s. Now, was it a montage made by an enlightened or there was something else behind that gigantic plot? In November 1954 he said he met the crew of a flying saucer. They had arrived from a planet located 14 years old from the Earth and were infiltrated and lived among us. If there was a especially terrible place for prisoners from the 16th century in Spain, that was the Tiranense Mataranya. In this Aragonese region, true terror monuments were built. But what was pursued by building these prisons of hell? Who could deserve punishment and depravity? Size, moisture, cold, lack of food, and lack of water. They condemned the person a few days later. And you would not die for one thing or another, for cold, by moisture, for hunger, or for the simple touch of the chains around the neck. In 1994, after hundreds of witnesses observed in the heavens the evolutions of an alleged meteorite, the residents of the populations of Serra de Oates, in La Coruña, were surprised by the appearance of a gigantic crater. What originated that huge destruction in the forest? Was there any relationship between this event and the mysterious object fallen from space? He said he had seen when he went down and was like a hurricane, like a mountain that came off. Because what could be seen was that pines that were there were displaced because almost 100 meters. Can I explain how one thing would have been there? They scared me. Can I enjoy? I can't explain. This is the red dwarf star Gliese 581. It is found 20 light years from the Earth. It is a little smaller than our Sun and has a system of 4 planets that revolve around it. One of which is at a distance such that it makes possible the presence of liquid water necessary for the formation of any type of life. Getting there seems unlikely, not at least for our generation and possibly for the immediately coming. But this has allowed us to reopen an old case, of which until a few years ago it was considered the only exhaustion inhabited. And there was certainty because researchers and scientists from Madrid of the 50s were firmly convinced that its inhabitants had already come into contact with us. They were the Ummitas and came from a planet called Smoke. Imagine for a moment this street 60 years ago. Madrid was an effervescent city that managed to get out of the terrible decade of famines and that wanted to know more about science, art, history. But also of alleged civilizations that inhabited sidereal distances. Everything began. Back in the 1954, a series of phenomena began to occur in Madrid that in principle did not jump into light and in which a Telefonica employee was then involved who was Fernando Sesma. Fernando Sesma dedicated his attention to an issue then emerging as was the flying saucers and decided to form a kind of gathering to deal with these issues. That gathering later resulted in the Society of Friends of Visitors of Space, which was the first entity of those legalized characteristics in Spain. Finally, in 1956, because they come to arrive in the old Leon Café and specifically in its basement, the Cheerful Whale, and from that moment on, the name of the Alegre Ballena because it will be indissolubly linked to the Sesmi group, with the Friends of the Space, because during the following 20 years, the presence of alleged visitors from other worlds were causing an interest in Spanish society through these individuals, of these men of culture who met in cafés, who met in literary centers, in Ateneos. And the event of Alberto San Martin had a lot to do with the explosion and with the comments that were made known in those oily. A nurse named Alberto San Martin, who in November 1954 said he met the crew of a flying saucer near the La Coruña road. And with the peculiarity that this alleged extraterrestrial handed him a kind of present or gift that consisted of an stone, of a cubic type and that on one of his faces he had 9 recorded signs. It was given a messianic meaning and it was a message that they wanted to convey from aliens to the terrestrial. It was the first time something like that happened in Spain and that caused it to have a huge impact. The stone was analyzed by the professor of the Madrid Institute of Mineralogia, Pedro García Bayon Campomanes, who had no repair in affirming that this stone was very rare and gave very strange reactions. It was the first test, the evidence for Sesma and its increasingly large group that they were contacting the aliens. As of January 1966, Fernando Sesma begins to receive telephone calls, always made by the same person, which was presented as an inhabitant or expeditionary of the planet Ummo. Next, or in the following days, I would send you a series of messages and those would be the first letters and reports known. It will basically be a political, social, religious, linguistic history of what was its culture and civilization. They had arrived from a planet located 14 years in Luz de la Earth. And they were infiltrated and lived among us and wanted to give some small clues of their existence. He talks about things truly curious such as a transport system that we did not know at that time on the Earth based on toroidal rings that were perfectly protected. There were letters that referred to cosmology, astronomy issues. Of medicine, in this case of subjects that then in the 60s 6 and 67 because they were not yet, they were too much like biogenetics. They wanted to improve our life. That is more or less what they wanted to convey, but there was no messianic message as it had occurred so far in all the other contacted that existed in the world. And this was perhaps what led to success, and to the impact, to the communications between the suits. During these alleged first contacts there were unusual, almost hopeful situations, such as this telephone communication addressed to the engineer Enrique Villagrasa for an alleged Ummita. Ask, to his brothers, yes, gathered, at home to my brothers, yes, well, okay. That is, they don't want us to ask their brothers questions. Fernando Sesma did not house doubts about the reality of the contact, nor did his followers either, they only needed a physical test, and this arrived on February 7, 1966. According to the news agency, several witnesses saw as an object, a flying dish, such as those that were then seen, and as the sign of smoke. In the belly of the artifact he had taken land in the Aluche neighborhood, in Madrid. There, the identity of one Mr. Jordan was already revealed, who claimed that at one point he observed how Ha was practically thrown out. An orange object and vaguely triangular. That object was descending until he landed at a short distance from where he was. The Ummitas did not announce their presence and did not say we are going to pilot one of our ships on such a city, but this was the only one of the occasions in which they had done so, and that agency came to confirm with that news and with that teletype that the UFOs had effectively fly over Madrid a few kilometers from the capital. Therefore, the case of the land, the messages or experience that Fernando Sesma was living could be something well real. In this same field dressed in ochre tones there was Aluche's alleged landing. And here were as proof of that event 3 deep traces forming a great triangle. Rectangular, with a kind of blades inside and separated from each other approximately 6 meters. It was the definitive proof that they had landed there. In May 64, a camera operator was at the naval base, I think it is, of the Americans, in the Bahamas. And at night, while I was preparing the theodolite, they were going to make a missile launch from a submarine. Then, suddenly 3 objects appeared with the famous H of smoke or whatever in the belly. And the guy filmed him. Immediately, as soon as the objects left, the Americans arrived and requisitioned the film. That is one of the many evidence that the smoke phenomenon regarding the ships with the famous H is true. 1 year and 4 months later, a new link, possibly the final one, came to join this long chain of events. It was about these castles, those of San Jose de Valderas, where a strange flying dish was photographed, in whose belly the unequivocal symbol of smoke was perfectly visible. The artifact, whatever it was, crossed the National 5 and perched on land, very close to the mountain of Santa Monica, next to a restaurant called La Ponderosa. One of the witnesses, next to the famous castle of San Jose de Valderas, was a girl at that time. That woman saw the ship and described it perfectly, and there were more witnesses too. Next to the traces of the famous UFO of San Jose de Valderas, very strange objects appeared that were a kind of metal cylinders inside whose interior there was a liquid that was not very clear but that had the texture of the water. And within it there was a kind of plastic lamellae that had recorded the smoke symbol. A year later, at the end of 1968, the National Institute of Aerospace Technique issued a report where he said that the plastic strip presented a chemical composition similar to that of the vinyl polyfluoride, a chemical composition that was then not very developed by terrestrial chemistry. It was more significant that the metallic rest had a 99% nickel purity, since there were no conventional objects at that time that contained a nickel composition as high as that. The wise were talking about the mystery of smoke. What is this? And who is behind those letters? Then it appears, because he had previously announced it, one of those artifacts with one of those symbols, the symbol that identified smoke, and was the stone that was missing to catapult the theme of smoke to the most important smoke within the phenomenon in its time. And that photograph is still absolutely referential when not only talking about smoke, but when talking about the UFO phenomenon. Fernando Sesma and his group of friends of space did not fit with joy. The presence of Ummitas was indisputable, but the euphoria went out and the doubts appeared. First about the photos of the dishes of San Jose de Valderas. And then, who seemed to be moving the threads in the shadow. The results of two independent studies were equal. The photographed object would not measure beyond 20 or 30 centimeters, that is, it would be a simple model hanging from a very fine thread, and that when the photographs were taken, a type of sensitivity would have been used such that it made it more difficult to appreciate the thread that would hang or turn on that model. The negatives analyzed among other laboratories, the image laboratory of the Civil Guard in Madrid. And the famous negative in which they say there was a thread that hung the model or whatever, it was not a thread, but a scratch of the negative. The negative was very spoiled, and I saw in the microscope how the rayon looks. So, it is not true that there is a model, that it was done with a model and such. Those are inventions that were later made. The ship was there. They were such spectacular photographs and responded to another of the ads that had made the Ummitas in their cards. They fulfilled their promise. There were the skies of Madrid and they were photographed. What happens? That they let themselves be photographed by who was the deceased and the creator of the entire mystery. There was an advanced moment in the 70s in which all this was questioned because evidently communications descended, and then it began to suspect that everything was nothing more than a montage or control by the authorities of the time, or a monumental scam or joke that was mainly starred by one of the characters that was most involved in the matter, which was José Luis Jordan Peña. The truth is that Jordan Peña, in each of the meetings that were produced in the different Madrid coffees in which fans of the world of aliens and the visits of the Ummitas joined, he seemed to always have more information. He had access to first-hand information within the scientific world and used those information to transmit them and make them go through messages and knowledge that the aliens had. We all started realizing that there were too many coincidences, there was too much small print in everything this man could know. And from that moment on, the case was totally dismantled. And then, in the end, he ended up recognizing that, indeed, he had been the author of the whole history of the Ummu planet. We had to wait almost 20 years for those suspicions to become firm and for him to finally end up confessing his participation in the creation of smoke. There are many doubts. I have investigated it a little, enough. There is part of the theme that yes, someone has probably put their hand. Of course, but there is another part of the phenomenon from its start that is authentic. What happens is that it is very uncomfortable. For many people the subject is very uncomfortable, but there was still a surprise. In 1989, the Soviet agency TASS informed half the world that in the Russian city of Voronet, several children claimed to have seen a strange object landing in a park, and descending from it, two very high beings. When drawing the artifact, at the base of it, the mysterious Ummitas symbol appeared. My opinion on the subject is that it is certainly very unlikely, if not impossible, that we are facing a history of extraterrestrial origin. It is possible that there could have been some type of essay, of sociological experiment where the singing voice may have been able to have some of the people who were initially related to the subject, or that they had served other interests that at the moment remain in anonymity. The truth is that at first I believed together in all this. Today, from the perspective I have, I know that everything was absolutely false. My personal opinion is that smoke is exactly that. A fraud that Jordan Peña did, and that has made the imagination of many people raise it to build it in a kind of theophany around ufology. I think that the phenomenon is real, although someone has put their hand and contaminated the case. I think you have to investigate it well and not be influenced, right? For the things one says and that says another. Apart that person who put his hand is a pathological liar. Lies of all colors have been caught in 27. Therefore, it has no credibility. Even if it tells the truth. I have the suspicion that behind all those letters and behind most of the information associated with smoke is José Luis Jordan Peña, his environment and people who, independently complete the work and mission of Jordan Peña. Therefore, there is no more conclusion than to say that it was a great fraud and that it is not necessary to believe it, but worth studying like anything else. On this matter there are too many doubts that plan. How could Jordan Peña, he alone, write thousands of pages of a very high technical and scientific content, also sending them from different parts of the world? That is why there are still many curious researchers, writers and even some politicians who think that beyond our sky, 14.6 light years from us, there is still an inhabited planet called smoke.